Okay, everybody, in this tutorial we're going to talk about writing valid HTML5. Anybody can slap together some HTML that doesn't conform to standards. It might get the job done, it might not. It might have tags that don't close, it might have metadata that you need to process or link to other documents missing. That's not what we want to make as technical writers. We want to make standards compliant, valid HTML5 documents that when we run them through the W3C validator pass. So that's what we're going to learn how to do in this tutorial. The objectives here, we're going to learn the parts of a valid HTML5 page. We'll talk about the basic metadata of HTML5. You could spend a lot of time talking about all the different metadata options. We're just going to cover the most essential. And then we'll learn how to validate the page and fix any errors that we find in the validator. So hopefully I'll screw up and we'll have an error to fix. If not, we'll break it and then you can see how we can run through the process of fixing it. And we'll also practice that in class as well. Here's what you're going to need, same as the other two tutorials that you already watched. You'll need a text editor, browser, and FTP client. Let's define some terms before we get into talking about the parts of the valid HTML5 page. First, let's talk about the viewport. That's where everything renders that the user can interact with or read in the browser. So that would be everything between the controls and the URL bar in a browser and the bottom of the window. So if you open up a browser, you can see that here are the tabs for your pages that you've got open. Here's your URL bar and controls, and then down here we've got the viewport. That's where all the content is. And the viewport starts up here below the URL bar and goes all the way down to the bottom. And the users resize the viewport to whatever size they want, depending on their device, if they're on a mobile phone or if they're on a tablet or a browser that has a wide screen like this. That's something that we have to account to when we develop the styles for the page, but we'll get to that in good time. Let's go back to the slides here. The next term that we need to be on the same page about is metadata. For the purposes of this course, we're talking about information that describes the site or the page that you're at currently. So that would be things like what language is the content in on the page, what's the character encoding for the page, the instructions you give to the browser, such as the title of the page, a description that you'll pass on to the search engine that indexes your page, and author, same idea, who wrote the page. And then any instructions or requests that you're making to robots that are going to be crawling your page. And we'll look at a few examples of each of those. The basic parts of an HTML document are the HTML element, which is the first element to open on the page and the last element to close. So remember last time I told you when you open the HTML document, when you open the HTML element, you'll want to close it and put that at the bottom of your page so that you don't forget. In addition to that, there are two new sections that you have to learn. Head is the section that contains all of the metadata and links to other files. Now for this class especially, we're going to want to link to CSS files so that we can style the page. And then the body element contains all the content that you want people to see on the page. So everything that's going to go in the viewport is going to go in the body element. And that's it. We're going to practice on the objectives document that we made last time, and we'll insert all of these required components into that document. Then we'll run it through the W3C validator to make sure that we didn't make any mistakes. And I'll show you quickly the process for correcting errors using the validator. So let's go ahead and open up our file that we had last time, objectives.html, and I'll put that into my text editor. So you'll remember this file. We can open it up in the browser as well. There we go. This is our objective slide from the last tutorial. Let's take a look at the HTML and put in all of the required components. So before we even get to the HTML, we need a line in the document to tell the browser what type of document we're serving it, and that's called the doc type declaration or document type declaration. So that starts with the right facing angle bracket, an exclamation point, and then doc type. Now the old doc type definition for HTML, it used to be something like HTML public, it's like W3 C DTD, and then there was the version number, which was like XHTML 1.0 strict, and then there would be after that a URL to the W3C. This is all just too much stuff, right? You don't have to remember that anymore. The new document type definition is just doc type HTML. For HTML5, that's all you need. So that's easy to remember. The old ones were quite long, and you really had to copy and paste them from old files. After that, we'll go down to the HTML element. Now we're going to add an attribute to explain to the browser and screen readers or any devices accessing the page what language we're using. And by language, I mean spoken language, right? So language, and then you're going to use the ISO country code. ISO is International Organization for Standardization, but you really just need language and then, or the lang attribute, and then en. All right, we already have the closing HTML element on the page, so we don't have to worry about that. Let us make the head and body elements now. So I'm going to open head and then leave a space to put content in, and then close it out, and then open body, and then we can close that out right above HTML. Don't worry about the spaces in between lines. You can have, as many spaces or as few spaces as you want. It doesn't matter. When the page renders, the browser's just going to ignore line breaks like that. It'll also ignore extra spaces you put between elements as well. And we'll talk about how to position stuff on the page vertically and horizontally when we get to CSS. But you can't do it just by inserting carriage returns or line breaks in your text editor. That won't have any effect. Let us talk about the metadata that we put inside of the head element. So we are going to start with the character set. So we'll use the meta element, and then you'll need an attribute. Attributes are the parts of the element that go in the opening tag and that specify settings, sources for files. You're familiar with the href attribute already in the A element, the anchor element, which points to the URL that you want the browser to go to. For meta and character set attribute, we're going to use the character set UTF-8. You can see sometimes you'll get these helpful pop-ups. I guess you just click on them there. This is a self-closing element, so we'll close it out. This just tells the browser what character set you want it to use when it's interpreting the character data. Now, as it parses, if it encounters a character that's not in the character set you specified, it will render it as a symbol. And you'll see either when you validate, if you have a non-UTF-8 character, the validator will point it out, or when you look at the page and it's rendered in the browser, you'll notice that you get a lot of crazy symbols. If you're interested in learning more about character sets, I found this article, Character Encoding for Beginners, on the W3C page. But you can see they have a couple examples here of what happens when you put non-UTF-8 characters in. Or if you'd select non-UTF-8 encoding and have UTF-8 characters. The important thing to remember is if you ever see something crazy happening in your text like this, that means you've got a character that's not in the UTF-8 character set. And we'll talk about how you can replace those in class. You can either change it to a character that is in UTF-8, or you can change it to an HTML entity. Again, we'll go over that in class. But this is the character set that you're going to want to use for work in this class. Let's add the title of the page. We can call this whatever we want. The title has two functions. Here, let me go ahead and, oops, I misspelled that. Let me go ahead and save this. If you look at the page in a browser, if there's no title declared, it's just going to say the file name up in the tab. When you declare a title, you'll see it changes to the value you specified for title in the head section. And I'm sure you probably put this together, but that is also the title that's going to appear on a search engine when you search for the index version of the site. So it's important to pick a descriptive title, since this is just a exercise. We don't have to think about it too hard. But when you're titling your page that you're submitting for your project or work that you're doing in the class later on, descriptive titles are important. Let's move on to the meta element that describes the content on the page, and that is meta. And then the name of that one is description. Again, you get those helpful pop-ups from time to time from your text editor. And then we want to include a content attribute that contains a description of the content on this page. And for this one, again, it's just an example, so we can basically put anything. Sure, that works. This is a self-closing element, so just make sure you close it out. I'll show you an example from a real website here. So here's the MDN Web Docs website. Anytime you have a question about any HTML or CSS element declaration, whatever it is, you can usually find the answer on this site. I would advise you use this site, not W3C Schools, which is not actually affiliated with the World Wide Web Consortium. This site has a lot of useful information, and it conforms to best practices. I think W3C has gotten better about that, especially in terms of accessibility, but I would still recommend this site. Anyway, we were talking about looking at the description of the content. If you inspect the source for the page, let's once this is up, we will do a search. I had this up already. Meta, and then I was looking for name, description, just like that. Here's the description content for the page. You can see it's got a couple sentences about what's on the page. And again, this is more than just for the purposes of documenting your content. This works for people who need a description of the page, but it's especially useful for search engines. So if I search Zilla Developer Network, yep, you'll notice that the description in the meta element on their web page corresponds with the description here on the Google search results. That will not only help people determine whether or not the page is something they need to click on to find the information they need, but it will also bump your page up in the search engine's rankings oftentimes. You'll hear people talk about search engine optimization. That's one of the things that will help get your page noticed. Now, you'll see that you don't get everything in the Google search results. It gets truncated. There's a line that's missing. that's okay. At least you've got something, and something is better than nothing. And the first description, or the first line of their description here, is a pretty good summary of the type of content that they have on their page. Lastly, let's talk about instructions to robots. So your page is going to get crawled by robots all the time, right? There's always robots on the web crawling and indexing pages. You can make a few requests using the meta element, and the name for that is robots. Now, for the content of this element, I'm just going to go ahead and close this out before I forget. For the content of this element, there's a lot of different options, and you can search on MDN to find all of the different values you can put in there. There's a few that I'll just run through quickly. Index means please index this page. No index is a request to robots crawling the page to say, please do not index this page when you find it. Now, I'll emphasize here that that's a request. That's not a requirement. So it won't actually stop the robot from indexing your page, but if it's a robot that accepts that request, it will not index the page. That's good if you have content that maybe you're going to change later. So I can only really think of an example that applies to myself off the top of my head. I guess I would say if I were putting something up like an exam that I wanted students to review, but then I didn't want that to be cached later because I might reuse questions later on, that would be a good candidate for no index. In terms of your resume, I don't understand why you wouldn't want that indexed really, because the point is to have employers find that. So I don't know if that'll be helpful for your project, but I wanted you to be aware of it nonetheless. There's a couple other requests you can make. Follow means follow the links on this page when it's indexing, and you can probably guess there's a no follow option as well. And then the last one is archive, or sorry, no archive. I don't know if there's an archive, but there's definitely no archive. That means do not cache the site. So when you look at Google search results, you'll see when you click on this drop-down menu, you can see the cached version of the site that they've saved. Another site that caches web pages would be the archive.org Wayback Machine that we've already seen in class that shows you the archival copies of websites. If you don't want to do any of these, you have no instructions for robots, you don't need that line. It's not required. The meta line in head, I don't know that that will cause a validation error if it's missing, but you should have all three of these in a well-formed page. And you should have the description not just for explaining to people what the content is, but as a reminder to yourself if you're working on a project, say, that's very large, or if you're working on a project that you're going to set down and come back to 5 years later, for instance, you'll want to remember what's in that page. Let's go ahead and validate this page, and I'll show you two different ways to validate. I've already got the validator pulled up here, but if you don't have that pulled up, you can just search for a W3C validator, and this will be the first URL that comes up. You can validate by URI if this is up on a web server, or you can validate by file upload if you haven't uploaded the file yet and you want to validate. So we'll do both. Let's do the file upload first. So there's my file. Make sure I save it, and then I will drag this over, put it into the file upload box, or you can, use their file browser to find it. Okay, that's good in the sense that there's no mistakes. Usually when you're writing, though, you'll make a mistake. I'm not excluding myself from that. Let's break this so that we have some mistakes to fix. So I'll get rid of that, and how about we forget to open H1, and then we'll accidentally close the OL that doesn't exist instead of having the UL closed. That should give us enough mistakes to fix. So let me get that file again and run it through. Okay, so I broke 3 things on the page, but I got 4 errors. That's not actually too bad. Depending on how well it truncates errors in the sub levels of the hierarchy, sometimes you'll get a lot of errors. So you'll break one thing, or you'll have one mistake in your HTML syntax, and you'll get maybe 17 errors or something like that. Most of the time, you don't have that many errors in your file. It'll just keep generating errors based on the initial mistake. They'll sort of cascade. What you want to do is start from the first error, find the line number 15, and it'll say stray end tag H1, and you can correct that first. So put the H1 back in. Then you save it, go back to the validator, and revalidate. Okay, so now we're down to 3. And then what you can do is, I showed you already what I broke on the page, so there's not a whole lot of value to going through and fixing all of the mistakes. But you can just keep fixing the errors that you find on the validator until you run it through the validator. And you get this. So those are errors. I'll show you a warning as well. Let's get rid of the language encoding attribute, and we'll validate it again. There you go. There's a warning. A warning is not always something to get concerned about when you're running the validation process. However, something like this, the language attribute, is something that you really should have in well-formed HTML. It's not going to throw an error on the validator, but you should have it. So I'll put that back in, and then check one more time. There we go. No errors. I'll just show you quickly how to check using the URL. It's essentially the same procedure, except that you'll have to be connected to your site. And then let me drop this over here. I'm going to overwrite. You'll need to be connected to your site, and then you'll need the URL. So let me go to mypages.it/arrowback/objectives. There it is. Okay. If we look at our source really quickly, we can see that we've got all of the required elements of a well-formed page. So now I will copy the URL. Oh, it's actually right here. And let me go back to the validator.w3org page. Paste in my URL, check, and it'll do the same thing. You can probably see that it's faster to validate by file upload when you're first working on the page, because you don't have to have that intermediate step of using the file transfer client to put it up onto your server before checking. But before you submit work in this class, you should upload everything, and then right before you submit it, make sure that you run it through the validator to get rid of any syntax errors. Most of the time, the errors that you find using the validator are going to be small. They're not going to impact the content of your page. However, there are instances where you can leave out metadata, or you can fail to close an element or something of that nature that will impact either humans' ability to read the page, users' ability to read the page, or it'll impact machines' ability to index the page. And that's not something we want as technical writers. We want everything to be syntactically correct to the best of our abilities and as time allows. Alright, that is the end of this tutorial.